Maria Santos never imagined she would be standing in an empty lot at 6 in the morning, holding a shovel with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The divorce papers had been finalized 3 weeks ago, and the custody battle had drained every penny from her savings account. Her ex-husband had kept the house, the car, and somehow managed to convince the judge that she was unfit to have their 8-year-old daughter Emma more than every other weekend. The morning air was crisp as she surveyed the small piece of land she had managed to scrape together enough money to buy. It wasn't much, just a quarter-acre on the outskirts of town, where the zoning laws were lenient and desperate people like her could try to start over. The real estate agent had been honest about its limitations: no water hookup, no electricity, and the soil was rocky at best. But it was hers, and more importantly, it was where she planned to prove to everyone, including herself, that she could provide a stable home for Emma. Maria had grown up watching her father build things with his hands. He was a carpenter who believed that a person's character could be measured by the quality of their work. Before the accident that took him when she was 16, he had taught her the basics: how to measure twice and cut once, how to read the grain of wood, how to drive a nail straight and true. She had forgotten most of it during her marriage to David, when her world had shrunk to managing his expectations and trying to be the perfect wife he demanded. Now, standing alone in the dawn light, those forgotten lessons came flooding back. She pulled out the crumpled notebook where she had sketched her plans. Nothing fancy, just a simple one-room structure that could serve as temporary shelter while she figured out her next steps. The building supply store had given her a list of materials and a skeptical look when she explained what she wanted to do. The clerk, a middle-aged man with calloused hands, had tried to talk her into hiring professionals. But Maria couldn't afford professionals. The little money she had left after buying the land was barely enough for materials. She would have to do this herself, one board at a time, one nail at a time. Her hands were soft from years of office work and homemaking, but she was determined to make them strong again. The first day was brutal. She started by marking out the foundation, using stakes and string the way she remembered her father doing. The measuring tape kept slipping from her sweating palms, and she had to redo the corners 3 times before they were square. By noon, her back ached and her hands were already developing blisters. She sat on an overturned bucket, eating a peanut butter sandwich and wondering if she had lost her mind. That afternoon, she began digging the holes for the concrete footings. The ground was harder than she had expected, full of roots and rocks that seemed determined to stop her progress. Each swing of the pickaxe sent shockwaves up her arms, and by evening she could barely grip the handle. But she had managed to dig 4 holes each, won a small victory against the doubt that whispered in her ear. The next morning brought new challenges. The concrete mixer she had rented was heavier than she expected, and mixing the concrete by hand left her arms feeling like rubber. She watched YouTube videos on her phone during breaks, learning techniques she should have mastered before starting. Twice she had to break up concrete that had set wrong and start over. Her neighbors, separated by enough distance to provide privacy but close enough to hear her struggles, began to take notice. Chen, an elderly woman who lived in the small house closest to Maria's lot, came over on the 3rd day carrying a thermos of coffee and a plate of homemade cookies. She didn't say much, just observed Maria's work with the keen eye of someone who had seen her share of hardship. Before leaving, she mentioned that her late husband had been a contractor and that she still had some of his tools in the garage if Maria needed them. By the end of the first week, Maria had managed to get the foundation footings in place and had started framing the floor. Her hands, once soft and manicured, were now rough and stained. Band-aids covered her knuckles, and her arms bore the purple bruises of inexperience. But there was something else growing alongside the physical transformation, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Emma's first visit to the construction site was both heartbreaking and inspiring. The 8-year-old stepped carefully around the lumber and tools, her face serious as she tried to understand what her mother was attempting. David had been filling her head with concerns about Maria's stability, questioning whether someone who was plain construction worker could provide proper care, but Emma surprised them both by picking up a small hammer and asking if she could help. Together, they spent the afternoon sorting nails by size and stacking lumber. Emma's enthusiasm was infectious, and for the first time since the divorce, Maria felt like they were working towards something positive together. When David came to pick Emma up, his expression darkened as he took in the scene. His criticism was sharp and immediate, questioning Maria's judgment and suggesting that this foolish project was proof of her instability. That night, alone in her small apartment, Maria almost gave up. The mountain of work ahead seemed impossible, And David's words echoed in her mind. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was being foolish. Maybe a woman with no construction experience had no business trying to build a shelter with her own hands. But the next morning, she returned to the lot. Chen was there early, having unlocked her garage and laid out an impressive collection of tools on a folding table. Power drill, circular saw, level, framing square, everything Maria needed, and more. The older woman explained that her husband would have wanted the tools to be used for something meaningful. With proper tools, the work progressed faster. Maria taught herself to use the circular saw, practicing on scrap pieces until she could make clean, straight cuts. She learned to trust the level, even when her eye wanted to argue with what it showed. Each new skill built on the last, and slowly, the frame of her shelter began to take shape. The local building inspector came by in the second week, drawn by a neighbor's complaint. Maria's heart pounded as he examined her work, checking measurements and testing joints. She was certain he would find fatal flaws, would shut down her project and confirm David's predictions of failure. Instead, he nodded approvingly at the foundation work and made a few suggestions about bracing. Before leaving, he mentioned that he admired anyone willing to do their own work and advised her to keep detailed photos for her records. Word began to spread through the small community. The woman building her own shelter became a local curiosity. Some people drove by slowly, craning their necks to see her progress. Others stopped to offer encouragement or advice. A few brought cold drinks on hot days or shared stories of their own construction adventures. Maria began to understand that she wasn't just building a shelter, she was building connections with people she had never noticed before. The walls went up next, and with them came new challenges. Holding long boards in place while securing them was nearly impossible alone. Maria developed a system using temporary braces and clamps, working in sections and double-checking every measurement. Her movements became more efficient as muscle memory developed. The nervous trembling that had plagued her hands during the first days gradually gave way to steady confidence. 3 weeks into the project, a severe thunderstorm threatened to destroy everything she had built. Maria spent a sleepless night, listening to the wind howl and rain pound against her apartment windows, imagining her unfinished shelter being torn apart. She arrived at the site the next morning expecting devastation but found that her framing had held strong. The storm had scattered some materials and filled her foundation with water, but the structure itself stood firm. That morning marked a turning point. Standing in the muddy lot, looking at her shelter that had survived its first real test, Maria felt something shift inside her chest. The constant anxiety that had followed her since the divorce began to ease. Her hands, when she held them out in front of her, were steady and sure. Emma's visits became more frequent as David's objections carried less weight. The girl had developed a genuine interest in the construction process and had appointed herself as the project's chief quality inspector. She would arrive with a small notebook, documenting progress and asking detailed questions about each step. Together, they learned about electrical systems and plumbing basics, planning for the utilities that would eventually make the shelter a true home. The roof presented the biggest challenge yet. Working alone at height, managing heavy sheets of plywood and ensuring everything was square and true pushed Maria to her limits. She rented scaffolding and worked methodically, one section at a time. Mrs. Daffer, Chen appointed herself as spotter, staying nearby with a phone ready in case of emergency. Other neighbors began finding excuses to walk by during the most dangerous parts of the work, offering help that Maria was finally ready to accept. By the end of the first month, the basic structure was complete. Maria stood inside her shelter for the first time, running her hands along the walls she had built with her own labor. The space was small but solid, a testament to determination and the willingness to learn. Emma danced around the empty room, her laughter echoing off the bare walls as she declared it the best house she had ever seen. But as Maria looked around her achievement, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Through the window opening, she could see a familiar figure standing at the edge of her property, arms crossed and expression stern. David had come to see what she had accomplished, and from the look on his face, he wasn't there to offer congratulations. The confrontation she had been dreading was finally at hand, and everything she had worked so hard to build was about to be put to its greatest test. David approached the shelter with the measured steps of a man accustomed to being in control. His expensive suit looked out of place on the construction site, and his polished shoes picked their way carefully around the scattered tools and materials. Maria stepped out of her shelter to meet him, her work clothes dusty and her hands still grimy from the morning's labor. The contrast between them had never been more apparent. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he walked slowly around the perimeter of the structure, his critical gaze taking in every detail. Maria watched him examine her work, looking for flaws she knew he would find. David had always been good at finding fault, at pointing out the ways she fell short of his expectations. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken accusations. Finally, he turned to face her. His expression was a mixture of disbelief and something else. Something that might have been fear. For 5 years of marriage, he had been the competent one, the provider, the one who made all the important decisions. Maria had been content to let him take the lead, to be the supportive wife who managed the household while he built his career. Now, looking at what she had accomplished on her own, the dynamic between them had shifted in ways he couldn't control. "This is what you've been wasting your time on?" His voice carried the same dismissive tone she remembered from their worst arguments. "Emma told me you've been playing construction worker, but I had to see it to believe it." Maria felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the automatic response to his criticism that had been conditioned into her over years of marriage. But something was different now. The hands that had trembled when she first picked up that shovel were steady as she crossed her arms. The woman who had once apologized for existing was gone, replaced by someone who had learned to trust her own capabilities. "I'm not playing anything, David. I'm building a home." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "A home? This is a shed, Maria. A poorly built shed that probably violates half a dozen building codes. Do you have any idea how this looks? My daughter spending time on a construction site with someone who thinks she's a carpenter?" The possessive way he said "my daughter" stung, but Maria held her ground. "Emma is proud of what we're building together. She's learning skills, gaining confidence. She's learning that her mother has lost touch with reality." David's voice rose, and several neighbors who had been working in their yards looked in their direction. He lowered his tone, but not his intensity. "The judge is going to hear about this, Maria. About your unstable living situation. About the dangerous environment you're exposing Emma to." Maria felt her resolve waver for a moment. The threat of losing more time with Emma was the one weapon David knew would always hit its mark. But as she looked past him at the shelter she had built with her own hands, she found strength she didn't know she possessed. "Dangerous?" she repeated. "Teaching a child that women can build things with their hands is dangerous? Showing her that when life knocks you down, you can get up and create something new? You're delusional if you think this changes anything." David gestured dismissively at the shelter. "You still don't have a proper job, still don't have stable housing. This little hobby of yours doesn't make you a suitable mother." Mrs. Chen chose that moment to emerge from her house, carrying a pitcher of lemonade and wearing the expression of someone who had heard enough. She had lived through the Great Depression, raised 4 children as a military wife, and buried a husband after 50 years of marriage. She was not easily intimidated by angry men in expensive suits. "Excuse me," she said, her voice polite but firm. "I couldn't help but overhear." "Are you Maria's ex-husband?" David turned toward her, his expression shifting to the practiced charm he used with people he considered important. "Yes, I am. I'm concerned about the safety of this project and its impact on my daughter." Mrs. Chen nodded thoughtfully, then walked past him to examine the shelter more closely. She tested a corner joint, checked the alignment of a wall, and peered up at the roofline. Her inspection was thorough and professional, drawing on decades of watching her contractor husband evaluate buildings. "Your ex-wife has done excellent work," she announced. "The foundation is solid, the framing is square and properly braced, and the craftsmanship is better than half the contractors in this county. My late husband would have been impressed." David's charm faltered. "With respect, ma'am, I don't think you're qualified to." "I've been around construction for 60 years, Mrs. Chen interrupted. "I know good work when I see it. More importantly, I know character when I see it. Your ex-wife has both." Other neighbors began to gather, drawn by the raised voices and the drama unfolding in their quiet community. Mr. Rodriguez, who owned the auto repair shop down the street, nodded his agreement with Mrs. Carvett, Chen's assessment. Sarah Williams, a single mother who lived 2 blocks away, stepped forward to add her support. "Maria has been an inspiration to all of us," Sarah said. "Watching her tackle this project, learning new skills, never giving up even when things got difficult. My own daughter looks up to her." David found himself surrounded by people who saw Maria differently than he did. To him, she had always been the woman who couldn't balance a checkbook, who needed his guidance to make important decisions, who fell apart under pressure. To them, She was the determined woman who had taken on an impossible challenge and was succeeding through sheer force of will. "This is all very touching," David said, his voice tight with frustration. "But it doesn't change the facts. Maria is living in a one-room apartment, working a part-time job, and now spending her free time on this project. That's not stability. That's not what Emma needs." Maria stepped forward, no longer willing to let others fight her battles. What Emma needs is a mother who shows her that she can overcome obstacles, that she doesn't have to depend on someone else to define her worth. What she needs is to see that sometimes the most important thing you can do is build something with your own hands, even if those hands are shaking when you start. The confrontation was interrupted by a familiar voice calling out from the street. Emma was running toward them. Having spotted her parents from the school bus window, she had convinced the driver to let her off at the usual stop so she could see the latest progress on the shelter. Her face lit up when she saw the gathering, assuming it was some kind of celebration. "Mom, did you finish the roof today? Can we start on the inside walls now?" She rushed past her father without acknowledging him. Her attention completely focused on the building project that had captured her imagination. David watched his daughter's enthusiasm with growing alarm. Emma walked confidently through the construction site, pointing out features she had helped plan, explaining the purpose of different tools, discussing the next phases of construction with the knowledge of someone who had been intimately involved in the process. "Look, Dad," Emma called out, having finally noticed his presence. "Mom taught me how to use a drill, and I helped measure all the windows. We're going to put solar panels on the roof, and there's going to be a reading nook by the big window." The pride in Emma's voice was unmistakable, and David realized he was witnessing something he hadn't expected. His daughter wasn't being endangered by Maria's project. She was being empowered by it. The confidence in her posture, the technical vocabulary she used, the obvious joy she took in her accomplishments, all spoke to positive changes he couldn't deny. But acknowledgement of Maria's success felt like admission of his own mistakes, and David wasn't ready for that level of self-reflection. Instead, he doubled down on his criticism, his voice growing sharper as his audience proved unsympathetic. "Emma, this isn't safe. Your mother should be focusing on finding a real job and a proper place to live, not playing with hammers and nails." Emma's face fell, confusion replacing the joy that had been there moments before. She looked between her parents, trying to understand why her father was upset about something that made her so proud. The gathered neighbors shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the familiar dynamic of a bitter divorce playing out in front of a child. Mrs. Chen stepped in again, her grandmother's instincts kicking in. "Emma, dear, why don't you show me how that drill works while your parents finish their conversation?" But Emma was too upset to be distracted. "Why are you being mean about Mum's house?" she asked her father directly. "She's working really hard, and it's going to be beautiful." David's control finally snapped. "Because it's not a house, Emma. It's a shack your mother is building because she can't afford a real place to live. Because she made bad choices and now she's trying to pretend that playing construction worker is the same as being a responsible adult." The cruelty in his words hit everyone like a slap. Emma's eyes filled with tears, and Maria felt the old familiar shame trying to creep back in. But something had changed during those weeks of building. The woman who had once absorbed David's criticism and turned it inward had learned to recognize it for what it was, his inability to accept that she could succeed without him. Maria knelt down in front of Emma, taking her daughter's hands in her own work-call-used palms. "Emma, there's nothing shameful about building something with your own hands. There's nothing wrong with starting over when life doesn't go the way you planned. What we're building here isn't just shelter. It's proof that we can take care of ourselves, that we can create something beautiful out of nothing." Emma nodded through her tears, understanding more than her 8 years should have allowed. She had lived through her parents' marriage, had seen the way her mother had seemed to shrink smaller each year. Now she was watching that same woman stand tall, literally building herself a new life one board at a time. David looked around at the faces surrounding him and realized he had lost this battle before it began. These people saw Maria as a hero, a symbol of determination and resilience. To them, his criticism made him look petty and threatened. The narrative he had been building about Maria's instability was crumbling in the face of obvious evidence to the contrary. But David had one more card to play, and he played it with calculated precision. "The custody agreement requires stable housing, Maria. He gestured at the shelter. "This isn't stable housing. It's a construction site. I'll be talking to my lawyer about supervised visitation until you can provide a proper home for Emma. The threat hung in the air like a physical presence, and Maria felt her carefully constructed confidence begin to waver. Losing Emma was her greatest fear, the one thing that could make her abandon everything she had worked for. David knew this, had always known exactly how to wound her most deeply. The neighbors began to murmur among themselves, and Maria could see doubt creeping into some of their expressions. Maybe David was right. Maybe a half-finished shelter on an undeveloped lot wasn't enough to prove her fitness as a mother. Maybe all her determination and hard work would count for nothing in a courtroom. Just as despair began to take hold, a new voice cut through the tension. A voice Maria didn't recognize, speaking with authority and confidence. She turned to see a man approaching from the street, someone who had been watching the confrontation unfold, but had finally decided to intervene. His presence would change everything that followed, in ways none of them could have predicted. The man walking toward them was tall and weathered, with the kind of deep tan that came from years of outdoor work. His clothes were practical, work boots, jeans, and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. But there was something in his bearing that commanded attention, a quiet confidence that made everyone turn to watch his approach. Maria had never seen him before, but Mrs. Berry, Chen's face lit up with recognition and relief. "Michael," she called out, "I was hoping you might stop by." Michael nodded to Mrs. Chen before turning his attention to the group gathered around Maria's shelter. His eyes swept over the structure with the practiced assessment of someone who understood construction, then settled on David with an expression that was polite but unmistakably measuring. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, his voice carrying the slight accent of someone who had grown up in the rural South. "I was driving by and couldn't help but notice this excellent piece of work. Mind if I take a closer look?" David stepped forward, clearly annoyed by another interruption to his confrontation with Maria. "This is a private family matter. I don't think—" "Actually," Mrs. Chen interrupted. "Michael here is a building contractor. He's been working in this county for 25 years. Michael, this is Maria Santos. She built this shelter herself, working alone most of the time." Michael's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise as he looked at Maria with new respect.
"You built this yourself? The whole thing?" Maria nodded, suddenly self-conscious under the scrutiny of a professional.
"I had help with advice and some tools, but yes. The labor was all mine." Michael walked around the structure slowly, his examination more thorough than Mrs. Chen's had been. He tested joints, checked for square corners, examined the foundation work with the critical eye of someone who had seen every possible mistake and shortcut. The group watched in tense silence as he conducted his inspection, David clearly hoping for professional validation of his criticism. Finally, Michael straightened up and faced the group. "This is outstanding work," he announced. "Better than half the crews I hire. The foundation is rock solid, the framing is textbook perfect, and the attention to detail is exceptional. Whoever taught you knew what they were doing." Maria felt a warm glow at the praise, remembering her father's patient lessons all those years ago. "My father was a carpenter. He died when I was 16, but he taught me the basics." "He taught you well," Michael said with obvious sincerity. "But more than that, you've got natural instincts for this work. The way you've braced these walls, the spacing on your foundation piers, the grade of your floor joists, that's not just following instructions. That's understanding how a building wants to stand." David's frustration was visible as his narrative of Maria's incompetence crumbled under professional scrutiny. "Look, Mr. Michael Thompson. Mr. Thompson, I appreciate your professional opinion, but the fact remains that this is not suitable housing for a child. There's no plumbing, no electricity, no proper insulation, all of which are easily remedied," Michael interrupted. "The hard part is done. The foundation, the framing, the roof, that's where most people fail. Everything else is just finishing work." He turned back to Maria, and she was surprised to see something like excitement in his eyes. "How are you planning to handle the electrical and plumbing?" Maria had been dreading these phases of the project, knowing they required expertise she didn't possess and permits she couldn't afford to obtain improperly. "I've been studying online courses and planning to hire professionals for the rough-in work. The finishing I thought I could handle myself." Michael nodded approvingly. "Smart approach. The electrical rough-in isn't something to mess with if you're not licensed. But I'll tell you what, I've got a job starting next month that's going to leave me with some extra materials. Good stuff, too. And my electrician knows me a favor." The implication of his offer hung in the air, and Maria felt her heart begin to race. Professional help from a contractor would solve her biggest remaining obstacles, but she knew she couldn't afford it. That's very generous, but I should tell you up front that I'm working with a very limited budget I probably can't afford. Who said anything about money? Michael's smile was warm and genuine. I've been in this business long enough to know that good work deserves support. Besides, I could use someone with your attention to detail on some of my smaller projects. Might be we could work out a trade arrangement. David's face was red with frustration and something that looked like panic. The story he had been telling himself and everyone else, that Maria was unstable, incompetent, unable to provide for Emma, was being systematically dismantled by evidence he couldn't argue with. "This is insane," he said, his voice rising again. "You people are enabling a fantasy. Maria doesn't have a job that can support this lifestyle. She doesn't have the skills or experience to maintain a property. She's playing house with construction toys while her daughter's future hangs in the balance." Michael's expression hardened slightly as he looked at David. "From what I can see, this woman has more practical skills than most of the college boys who show up on my job sites thinking they know everything. She's built something solid and beautiful with her own hands, and she's done it while dealing with what I'm guessing has been plenty of criticism and doubt." Emma, who had been quiet during most of the exchange, suddenly stepped forward. Her young voice cut through the adult tensions with startling clarity. "My dad thinks Mum can't do anything right," she said, looking directly at Michael. "But she can. She taught me how to read blueprints and how to use tools safely and how to solve problems when things don't work the first time. She never gives up, even when it's really hard." The simple honesty of Emma's words had more impact than all of the adult arguments combined. Maria knelt down and hugged her daughter, feeling the fierce protectiveness that had driven her to attempt this impossible project in the first place. Michael crouched down to Emma's level. "Your mum sounds like a pretty amazing person. What's your favorite part about the house?" Emma's face brightened as she launched into an enthusiastic description of the reading nook they had planned, the garden space where they would grow vegetables, the workshop area where they could build furniture together. Her knowledge of the project was encyclopedic, and her pride in her mother's accomplishments was unmistakable. As Emma talked, Maria noticed other changes in her daughter. The confidence with which she spoke, the technical vocabulary she used naturally, the way she gestured like someone accustomed to explaining complex ideas. The project had given Emma more than just time with her mother. It had given her a sense of capability and purpose. Michael listened to Emma's description with the patient attention of someone who understood that children's dreams were serious business. When she finished, he stood and turned back to the adults. "Santos," he said formally, "I'd like to make you a proposition. I've got a small development project starting in 3 months. 6 houses. Nothing fancy, but good, solid construction. I could use an assistant who pays attention to details and isn't afraid of hard work. The pay would be fair, and you'd learn enough about the business to start taking on small projects yourself eventually." Maria stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. A job in construction, using the skills she was developing, earning enough money to support herself and Emma properly. It seemed too good to be true. "I don't have any formal training," she said hesitantly. "No certifications or—" "You've got something better than certificates," Michael said firmly. "You've got the hands-on experience of building something from scratch. You've got the patience to do things right the first time. And you've got the determination to see a project through to completion even when everyone around you says it can't be done." David made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. "This is all very inspiring, but it doesn't change the legal realities. Maria still doesn't have proper housing, still doesn't have stable employment. A handshake deal with a contractor she met 5 minutes ago isn't going to impress a family court judge." Michael's response was calm but firm. "Actually, I think it might. See, I serve on the county zoning board, and I've worked with most of the judges in this district on various construction disputes. They tend to respect practical competence over theoretical credentials. A woman who can build her own shelter and earn a steady living in construction trades, that's someone who can provide stability." He pulled out his phone and took several photos of the shelter from different angles. "Santos, would you mind if I shared these photos with some colleagues? There's a woman in the county planning office who's been looking for examples of quality owner-built structures. Your work here could help change some regulations that make it harder for people to build their own homes." Maria nodded, still trying to process the dramatic shift her life had taken in the span of an hour. The project she had started as a desperate attempt to prove her worth had become something larger, a symbol of possibility for others facing similar challenges. Emma tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom, does this mean we can finish the house now? Can I help with the electrical work?" "You can help with the safe parts," Maria said, ruffling her daughter's hair. "But first we need to finish the walls and get the roof properly sealed." As the group began to disperse, David found himself increasingly isolated. His supporters had melted away as the evidence mounted against his portrayal of Maria. Even Emma was looking at him with something approaching disappointment, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Mrs. Chen approached Maria with a gentle smile. "I've been thinking about your project since you started. My husband left me more tools than one person could ever use, and it would make me happy to know they were helping someone build a real home. Would you consider accepting them as a gift?" The generosity of her neighbors, the professional validation, the job offer, the support of her daughter, all of it combined to create a moment of clarity that Maria had been working toward without realizing it. She wasn't just building a shelter anymore. She was building a new life, one where her worth wasn't determined by someone else's opinion of her capabilities. Michael handed her a business card. "Think about my offer. The job starts in 12 weeks, which should give you time to finish this place and get moved in properly. In the meantime, I'll send my electrician over to look at your roughing needs. No charge for the consultation." As David walked away, his threats and criticisms seeming suddenly hollow, Emma slipped her hand into Maria's. "Mum, I think this is going to be the best house ever." Maria looked at her shelter, no longer just a desperate gamble, but the foundation of a new beginning, and felt the last of her trembling fade away. Her hands were steady now, calloused and confident, ready for whatever came next. She had built more than a shelter. She had built proof that sometimes the most impossible dreams were just waiting for someone brave enough to pick up a hammer and start. 3 months later, when the shelter was complete and they had moved in permanently, Emma would plant a small garden beside the front door. The vegetables would grow strong in the rocky soil, tended by 2 pairs of hands that had learned the value of building something lasting from the ground up. And every morning, as Maria prepared for another day at her construction job, she would look at what they had accomplished together and know that some foundations, once properly laid, could support any weight that life chose to place upon them.